Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my lecture. So today we are going to talk about taxation and economic efficiency, and in our last lecture, if you recall, we have already discussed about taxation and different relationship, and also we tried to understand how taxation happens when in the case of general equilibrium, like more than one market. So even tax is imposed in one market, but then it has some of the impact on the other markets as well. So let us discuss today, spend a bit more time on the taxation and economic efficiency when we are talking about tax incidence and economic efficiency. So when we talk about tax and economic efficiency, what are we talking about? The first is efficiency cost. So these are the few points, theoretical points, that we are supposed to know before we proceed further. So this efficiency cost, it arises from the transaction that do not occur that would have generated surplus. So taxes transfer spending power from taxpayer to government. So it's basically government's revenue gets generated, but then individuals' income, like persons in income, will be reduced. So the same discussion point that we actually discussed in case of macro aggregate demands function, where we had written capital Y equals to C plus I plus G. So here, when we are talking about tax transfer from individual person to the government, we are actually talking about disposable income, which is nothing like Y minus T, and T is a total tax collection, and T becomes tax revenue, and then T will go to the society, or T will be allocated through government expenditure, like say government spending. So this is what we are trying to kind of highlight here. So when we are talking about tax transfer, it is actually individual's income is shrinking, but then government tax revenue will be increasing. So obviously, so income will decrease after the tax deduction, but then total tax revenue will be increased after tax collection from the individual person to the government. So here this is nothing, is basically the income effect for the individual, like income effect is decreasing, but then total income or total revenue will be increased in the government. So it is basically it shows the income effect. So that's what we would like to highlight here, that an income effect which does not necessarily result in economic efficiency. So taxes may also distort consumer choice between goods, because there is also another point, like say a substitution effect. And if we can think of the last example that we had given in our last lecture, where in case of taxation or tax incidence in general equilibrium, so there we had taken the example of bread. So for example, if price of the bread has increased due to taxation, but then price of the rice has not changed, and if some population or some people, bread and rice, they are closely substituted, then certainly there will be substitution effect to consume more on the rice because of the rise in the price of the bread. So this is basically due to the changes in the relative price. So these are the things that we already discussed even in context of price and demand and different types of goods in our initial lectures. And in case you want to even further understand this, you can actually go to those videos, and then you can actually relook into those discussions with the references that we provided. So now, interference with the consumer choice can generate an excess burden of taxation. So this is what primary discussion point in this particular lecture. So we'll discuss more in details. So what do we mean by economic burden? So this is important because the reduction in the total economic surplus that results from the adoption of a policy, like for example, if tax is imposed on the supply, and then certainly demand curve, supply curve will be shifting, and then will be deviating from the original equilibrium point where demand and supply is is intersecting with each other. So if supply curve is shifting and deviating from the original equilibrium point, then definitely there is a rise in the price but of the commodity, but at the same time there is a loss for this for the loss from the society's point of view, what we call deadweight loss. So in Pareto efficiency's point, and also in context of externality, we actually did talk about this. So and if you recall the examples of say say negative production externalities, if we take that as an example. So tax is imposed on the productions, and therefore supply of that particular product has has shifted, has impacted and has shifted leftward, and therefore the point that before taxation, the point where demand and supply they were intersecting, so that was what we referred as private market efficiency point. So from market's point of view, private market's point of view, that point at which demand and supply they are actually related to, intersecting to each other, that is optimum. But that is not necessarily that will be socially optimum. Why? Because that is not economic efficient point, because some of the other communities, for instance, in our example that we used in our externalities context, like population who are living on the river, so those population or the livelihood on the river will be affected, and that is what the negative externalities that we are talking about here. And in this case, although it is not private market efficiency after the imposition of the taxes, but then definitely that is a social efficiency, because it is also imposed, like either through compensation that those affected population will be getting it, or it is some sort of check and balance for the overall production and overall environmental degradation or environmental water pollutions in particular. So in this particular context, like this is certainly economic burden, and economic burden with the same concept that we can discuss in context of deadweight loss. So now the deadweight loss, this is the area which is approximately that we also have shown. If it is linear demand and linear supply curve, then certainly this is the triangle area in shape. But if it is not linear, then it is approximately triangle areas that we are actually trying to we need to calculate how it is, how we are actually getting that particular area, which is actually deadweight loss or the social cost or social loss that we can actually talk about. So that is actually economic burden from the economics point of view. So now let us understand excess burden of the taxation with our existing knowledge, whatever that we acquired, and also the components that we already have so far used. So just to start with, because we'll go much more in details. For example, price on the vertical axis and quantity is with the is along with the horizontal axis, and this is the demand curve, and say this is supply curve, like S1, which is actually before tax, after taxation, which is S2, which is nothing, it's like S1 plus T is Q1, like OQ1, OP1, and here is the price which is called OP1, and A is the equilibrium point, and then after imposition of the tax, it is quantity is getting reduced and price has increased from P1 to P2, and we get the new equilibrium point, which is point B. The area, like we have another one point C, and then area that between, or the amount like between B and C, it is nothing, it is the tax, and the area that we are now losing from here is triangle area of ABC is the dead weight loss, right? So this is the dead weight loss, and this is basically because of the imposition of the tax. So this dead weight loss, this area we can refer as economic burden, right? So as we know, I mean, we also have shown couple of times that, you know, after imposition of the taxes, quantity will be reduced, price will be increased, and then overall dead weight loss will be there, which is the economic burden. Like it is not, it is socially optimum, but then not from economics point of view is much more optimum, because here equilibrium of demand and supply, they are actually intersecting at each other. So this is the point that we are supposed to discuss further more. So let's try to understand the excess burden characteristics. So what are the characteristics for the excess burden? So one is excess burden increase with the square of the tax rate, and let us establish that. Now let us see what happens here. Like here, P, price along with the vertical axis, Q along with the horizontal axis, and here is the demand. Like suppose S1 is the first initial supply curve of the commodity, then assume S2, which is S1 plus T. So this is like, you know, T amount, and then if we look at equilibrium point, like say point A, point B, here Q1 and Q2. So here P1 and P2. So quantity is reduced, price increases. Now suppose one more tax is imposed, the same amount of tax, like here say one more. So S3, which is nothing, is basically S1 plus 2T. Like tax is double now. So what happens? We get new equilibrium point, and that equilibrium point is C, and then total production further reduced, price increased, further increased. So A, B, C, right? So now look at the point of the from the dead weight losses point of view. So first dead weight loss after imposing of the taxes, the first tax, like first T, it is like this small red triangle area. When we introduce or impose one more tax, then the area becomes much more larger as compared to A, B, say here D, and here if we can consider E. So of course A, B, D area is much smaller than A, C, E area, like all the dotted area, like entire dotted area. So this is what, graphically we have shown you how it looks like. So now let us calculate mathematically, like what is the economic EB, what is the area? So area is basically ABD, which is like the formula 1 by 2 by like T, like this area, and then changes in the quantity. Here like this area Q1 and Q2, that particular the section here. Then 1 by 2 by this T is nothing, this is change in price here exactly. If we look at, so this is the kind of changes of price, and then here it is delta P, which is changes in price, and delta Q, which is changes in quantity. So now one can rewrite delta P then by delta Q by delta P, and then again we can write like delta P. So here we can again write delta P by delta Q by delta P, then P by Q, then Q by P, and then again delta P. So now we can write this as 1 by 2 delta P square into elasticity, like this is just this is a functional relationship that we are talking about, multiplied by Q by P. So now delta P is nothing, again it is kind of value of T, so half T square multiplied by E by Q by P. So this is what the economic burden, that's how it is related. So economic burden is precisely or deadweight loss, we can say deadweight loss also, or economic burden, it is proportionate to the T square, which is tax rate, so or tax that is imposed. So now just to see, so economic burden is proportionate to T square, like tax square. Capital T, say ad valorem tax is like nothing, is total tax is basically tax per price, like the price. So here we can further we can write this as small t is capital T P, and then if you recollect again, we can bring this, we can actually write this as equation 1. So equation 1, from equation 1 what we get, EB equals to half T E then Q by P, and here T square, and here 1 by 2 by capital T square P square, then E, then Q by P. So here 1 by 2, then T square E, P and Q. So here we can give it, this is equation 2, and then we can write, I mean this is very interesting, like economic burden is depending on a lot of things. It is economic burden, it is depending on the total tax or per unit tax, and elasticity, price and quantity, or total revenue. So if total revenue is also known and elasticity of the goods is known, and then we can actually calculate how economic burden in the economy or in the society is actually having it, if we have the value, I mean if we know the what is the amount of the taxes. So this is one, just the argument that we are trying to make it here, like economic burden is the square, I mean economic burden will be more if taxes is more. So because economic burden is proportionately to the tax rate. So let us just take a quick sort of example, like say 1 2 3 4 5 individuals are there, and then so now here, I mean it is very clear, like we have E, P and Q that also has an impact on the economic burden, but then we are trying to establish the relationship that how economic burden is solely, it is actually related to the tax, and then with the tax square it will, I mean burden will be even more. So now say tax is imposed like small t, like say 4 4 4 4 and 4. So it is like kind of very small tax rate, and then tax revenue in this case is like just 20. So now the argument is like lower tax rate will give much more much less economic burden, and higher tax rate to few few individuals or few groups will have higher economic burden to the economy. So this is the point that I am trying to establish here. So total, I mean T square will be say 16 16 16 16 and 16, and here total tax revenue is 80. So now this is one set of case. So now imagine next set of case is like same 5 groups or individuals, but then we are having very high rate of tax only on 2 groups, and then let's see how it happens. So here T square will be 100 and 100, and here tax revenue will be 20 with the same tax revenue like 20, but then tax burden is basically 200. So this 80 is economic burden and 200 is economic burden. So now you see with a smaller rate of tax like 4 for instance 4 and then we get 20 revenue, but then economic burden is just 80. But then if we have, I mean out of 5 only 2 groups or 2 individuals are heavily taxed, like say 10%, then economic burden will be 200, which is much more higher than the 80. So this is what the point that we are trying to make it from the policy's point of view, like spread tax across all the goods to keep tax rate low rather than imposing taxes on certain goods and keeping other goods out of the tax system. So this is very important when when government formulate the taxation, and then also try to understand what types of goods and commodities that to be taxed, and also elasticity of the goods also needs to be understood, and that's how taxations and revenue and economic burdens one can actually calculate. So with this simple example, we can see that if tax a low amount of tax is imposed in all the individuals, like here 5 individuals, and then each of them are actually imposed by very smaller amount, like 4%, rather like only 2% here, individual 1 and 2 are heavily taxed like 10%. But then we can see that economic burden with a lower tax and spreading across all the group, like in the 5 groups, is much more lesser as compared to only 2% who are actually heavily taxed. So this is what we wanted to discuss, like economic burden is primarily proportionate to the square root of the tax. So now let's move further, like excess burden increases with elasticity. So this is I think by now we already know that higher elasticity of demand, more distortion and more deadweight loss. And then we can actually discuss as we go, like there are 2 graphical illustration that we can take. With the help of these 2, then we can actually explain that what we mean that about deadweight loss. Like say in one case, like demand curve is very is inelastic, relatively inelastic, and then other case is relatively elastic. So now in panel 1 and then panel 2. So here in panel 1 P and Q, panel 2 P and Q here. So panel 1 is the demand curve and panel 2 is the demand curve here. So now suppose supply curve S1 for a commodity, for any commodity which is inelastic in nature, right? So here is the equilibrium. Now suppose tax is imposed on the commodity and supply curve moves leftward, and then we get new equilibrium point which is P, and here quantity gets reduced and then price increase to P2. So here what is the deadweight loss area? So this is the area. The area deadweight loss is the area of A, B, C in case of linear curve. So now in panel 2, say supply S1 and then taxation is added, like small t is added, and then supply curve shifts from S1 to S2 is after taxes, and then we can see quantity is reduced from OQ1 to OQ2, and we can see price increase from P1 to P2, and then area that we loss, like which is deadweight loss or economic burden, is the area is say A, B, C. So A, B, C under say panel 2 and here under panel 1. So definitely so we can say that deadweight loss A1 and deadweight loss 2. So deadweight loss under panel 2 is higher than deadweight loss panel 1, and it clearly shows that with the goods which are for price elasticity of demand which is relatively elastic, so deadweight loss for the society will be much more higher as compared to goods which is relatively inelastic. We are not saying perfectly inelastic, but relatively inelastic. If we impose on the tax on that, that will be much more less burden for the government. So that is how the social cost and economic burden one can actually understand. So this is what we try to show you that elasticity. I have been keep on telling you that elasticities are very, very important, and one of the most important economic components or the economic measures to calculate even types of commodity, right from the types of commodity to the overall economic burdens, or calculating economic burdens or the losses from the economy. So now let's move further, and we already discussed this. Just to bring Laffer curve once again here in context of tax. The Laffer curve depicts the relationship between, as we already discussed, like tax rate and tax revenue, and then it shows inverted U shape, and here if it is tax revenue is measured along with the vertical axis, and if tax rate is measured along with the horizontal axis, so then first it will tax as as tax rate increases, then tax revenue also will increase, and then it reaches at the maximum, and then as tax rate increases, then tax revenue will start declining. So this is what we discussed in context of Laffer curve. So this I would wanted to again discuss here, so that we can establish and also give you the context in context of tax incidence and economic burdens context. So I will stop here, and these are the three references that I have used for this particular lecture. So along with Jonathan Gruber and Joseph Stiglitz, you're also I will highly recommend this particular working paper that you please go through. This is called The Theory of Excess Burden and Optimal Taxation, which was published by NBER in 1982 by Auerbach. I mean, he had written that. So I would recommend this for all of you to read these three, and then for more explanations and for other examples that have been given in these books. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll stop here, and then I'll see you in my next class.